weeks, but then we start back on the 9th, which is going to be Dr. Dent from Duke on a session on cardio-oncology. So, please sign up for meeting with her as well. You must have received emails. And then, yep, exactly. So today we have the privilege of having Dr. Katie Berlacher visit us with us today. She's a cardiologist in Pittsburgh, an echocardiographer, and more importantly, I mean, she's had such an important role in understanding how education is a science, and that has to be done well, not only for trainees, which she leads the cardiology fellowship program at UPMC, but also for adult learners like us and cardiologists, and has played a key role in defining the emerging faculty leadership academy at ACC, where I was a member this year and had learned so much. And then, but also like our national meeting at the ACC, which she is vice chaired for 2 years, and will be leading for the upcoming 2 years as well. So, and clinically, she's played a key role as the clinical director of the Maggie Women's Heart Center at UPMC, and thinking about cardio obstetrics as a standalone specialty that deserves the clinical space and domain it is now progressively getting, and then thinking about nurturing the next generation of trainees in that domain. This is my great honor to have have her here and the privilege of introducing her to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think I'm on, so we will not use this. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thanks to everybody who has been with me today. I will say it has been a whirlwind of people back to back to back, a lot of fellows, a lot of really great discussions. I am feeling very grateful at the end of the day, and very thankful that there's also more food to come in the near future, and some sitting. So I am thrilled today to talk about one of my favorite subjects. As Rohan said, medical education has been something that is near and dear to me for many years. I'll tell you a little bit about my story as we start, but my hope over the next hour, maybe less, so that we can have a little bit more interactive discussion, is to talk about the future of medical education. And I have an answer for this question, but I would love for you to come up with your own answer for this question that's on the board by the end of this talk. And I'll really start actually just in the room, show of hands of faculty members who have been in practice for more than 10 years. Okay, show of faculty members who are less than 10 years. Couple, okay, and then show of fellows. Okay, and then I don't know if anybody is looking online. Do we know how many people are online? 30, okay. And if you guys want to put it into the chat, that would be great. And I can have somebody feed me that information in a little bit. But, before I even get into like a conflict of interest slide and everything, I really want to talk about this dreamy or doomed binary here, okay? So my hope by the end is that you answer one way or the other. You can't get it wrong necessarily, although I would love for you to be able to argue which way you want. And I'm just going to poll the crowd here. So I'm going to put up some nouns here. These are nouns of different people and things within medical education. So learners, educators, workforce, scores, grades, AI, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. And depending on where you fall on the spectrum right now, I want you to think in your head before I flash some adjectives. How do you describe in your head learners in medical education right now, educators in medical education right now, the workforce? What is the first adjective that you think of for these nouns? Okay. I'm going to flash them in just a second. Get ready. Okay. So these are some of the adjectives that I came up with that would fit in those two big buckets of dreamy versus doomed, okay? And depending on where you are, maybe you're in undergraduate medical education, maybe you're in graduate medical education, maybe you're in continuous medical education and dealing with faculty as learners, right? And maybe you use, depending on the setting, both sides of that equation, right? I want you to think about whether or not you've convinced yourself, before I get into this, what you think the future of medical education is. Now, we're in a biased group of academic medical educators that are committing their lives to, hopefully, education in the future. And so my hope is that you start a little bit on the dreamy side. Otherwise, man, you're really like in a sad life here in an academic medical center. But my guess is if you're being honest with yourself on a bad day, many of us, myself included, have used those adjectives on the doomed side, right? Yes. Okay. All right. I do not have any conflict of interest, although I will acknowledge, as Rohan said, I do a lot of work for the American College of Cardiology as well as UPMC, and I've been on Cardio Nerds a number of times. These are my loves. I love them a lot, but I really don't get any kickback from any of them. And my confession, more importantly than my conflict of interest, my confession is that I really like to interact with people. So if there is ever a point during this talk that you have a question or you want to argue with me or say something, please just raise your hand and I will stop, and I will have somebody looking at the chat online too. All right, basic just learning objectives. What my hope is that you can take away, other than answering that question in your head, which is really just for your benefit, but the objective truths that I want you to be able to answer is be able to describe 2 principles of andragogy, list 1 way to apply the concepts of learning science to your own learning. So you as a learner rather than you as an educator. And then last, describe a current trend in medical education that can be optimally integrated into the field. Okay, so these are the 3 things that at the end of the day, my hope is that you can do. I know this is markedly different than most of the other grand rounds that you get. And this could probably influence your day-to-day learning more so than many others, okay? And we'll talk about why that is in the future. I said I would talk a little bit about my past. I will talk about my past in Dr. Seuss's most famous graduation book for everybody. I started schooling in general, the formal schooling at this grade school, which is St. Joe's. I went to in Sylvania, Ohio, Northwest Ohio, and this was the traditional school, okay? You go to classes, you have didactics, and it was nothing special, pretty standard stuff. I went to this all-girls Catholic high school, and is again the same thing that traditional teaching is in high school. 45-minute sessions in the basic stuff. Again, didactic learning, maybe a little interaction when you were doing a lab, but nothing much more. Duke, I went here for undergrad. I majored in women's studies and did my pre-med. It was really great. Again, all standard stuff. A lot of rooms like this with somebody lecturing at me and me taking notes and then proving my knowledge, by taking a multiple choice question, right? And then I went here. So I went to the Ohio State University for medical school. And this was the first time that I actually thought about my learning, which I would challenge all of you to reflect for a moment and think about the first time that you actually thought about your learning rather than just going to all of the schooling and the education that we just do blindly most of the time. I did a problem-based learning pathway for my first 2 years of medical school. This was different. There were only 30 of us in the pathway. I never went to a didactic lecture during my first 2 years of medical school, okay? And this was before PBL was really integrated into medical school, so I'm sure there are some residents or fellows listening, maybe even medical students that are like, PBL's in everything. Well, it wasn't always in everything way back when. This was something that later got integrated because problem-based learning, or really case-based learning, did not come to the public, or at least dissemination across all medical schools until this time. This is when I first was like, oh, I could choose my own textbook. Why would I choose this one instead of that one, right? The first time that I really thought about education. And then it was here at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center where I was like, man, if we're gonna have medical educators, we really should train them to be medical educators. So I did a master's degree in medical education through the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. And now this is the McGee Women's Hospital where I do a lot of cardio obstetrics, which is, very, very fun, but not something that we're gonna talk about today. All right, so all of those places combined got me to think about this, andragogy. So andragogy is different than pedagogy, which is the art and science of adult learning. And I put science there, and Rohan, thank you so much for thinking about the science of learning. We think about the science of cardiology all of the time, but we honestly don't think about the science of learning all that often as cardiologists. And I would challenge you to turn off your cardiology brain for a second, but apply all of that data and the evidence that got you to be a cardiologist to be a learner. Okay, so there's this guy named Malcolm Knowles. He was really the foundational thinker, or one of the many foundational thinker for andragogy. And he had 4 principles, So the Knowles principles of adult learning, 4 of them, okay? And then many people built on them. So this is really just a quick 101. So we get through. Adults like to do their learning in a self-directed way. So for my fellows out there, raise a hand of the fellows. What rotation are you on right now? You're on Echo. So when you are on Echo, do you like to read and study Echo, or do you like to read and study Cath or MRI or CT? And you will not offend any of the multimodality images here. Right? Okay, so good. So you like to be in charge of what you study and when you are in a certain rotation. And good news, that does not change. When you get to be a faculty member, you no longer have rotations. You continue to want to read and study what you want to read and study, right? Based on what it is that you need for that moment. You also want to read and study and learn things that are immediately applicable. That's why it is much harder to learn something that is not going to be applied for a year. So if you think about your first year as a fellow, it was really hard to learn TEE unless you were going to be on TEE in the next rotation. Most first years across the country don't do TEE their first year, right? So that to them is like, man, I really just don't want to think about it. I need to learn something that is immediately applicable right now. The third principle that Malcolm Knowles talked about was experiential. And as you can see purposefully this picture, kids and adults like to learn from experience by doing. We like to do things, and by doing those things, we actually learn from them. And then last but not least, we like to learn things that are applicable to the real life. It is much harder for us to retain information that is not applicable to our day-to-day life. Something that is so esoteric or incredibly theoretical is much harder for us to grasp in the long terms. Okay, so these are 4 main principles. I already got to one of your learning objectives. Okay, by the end of the day, 4 main learning adult learning principles by Malcolm Knowles. So my hope is then, this is a leading question, what is the optimal foundation for medical education? Right? The foundation, quite simply, because medical education is really all the learners are adults, right? The foundation really should be all the principles of adult learning. All those principles that I just talked about, self-directed, immediately applicable, experiential, real life relevance. We should use all of those, not only for our rotations in our curriculum and training with medical students and residents and fellows, but also with faculty. You don't stop learning just because you are done with fellowship, right? For them, you know, it was my 3rd year of fellowship when TAVRs came out. And if I would have stopped learning at that point in time, I would not be a very good cardiologist. And many of the other cardiologists in this group are the same. Yes. Right. Well, a new learner, different than an adult learner, and a fellow. Yep. So they need guidance. So fellows need educators, just like you in this audience. They need structure. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's self-directed.
Yeah.
And they want to learn what they want to sort of direct their learning, but
right.
They don't really fully know all the things they're going to need.
Exactly. So they need supervision and they need guidance, certainly within their structure, but not entirely, right? So no fellow wants to be told, I need you to read this chapter tonight, all 20 fellows, I need you to read this chapter tonight, right? So all of us, and I think fellows are on the continuum of adults, that they need a little bit more supervision until they become independent. And then that adult learning becomes truly self-directed, whereas in the beginning it is partially self-directed, right? So as we think about adult learning, one of my favorite principles is this, the learning edge, okay? The learning edge was honestly the most palpable concept to me when I first started studying andragogy. And this is the point where a learner is mentally stimulated so much that they're challenged. I'm a little outside of my comfort zone, but I'm not so uncomfortable. I'm not so overly challenged that I'm falling off the cliff, right? That I can't think about this, I'm too stressed. And really this actually comes from a person who was working in computer science and published this about the learning within computer science back in the early 2000s. And he identified the learning edge as such, so that On the bottom, you can see the competency of the task. So if you are not very competent, you are on the far left-hand side. Moving across the x-axis to the far right-hand side, you become very competent, okay? And on the y-axis is the difficulty of the task. The very top of the difficulty of the task is super, super hard. So you can imagine if you are really competent at something, far right-hand side, and the task is not very difficult, you're gonna be bored at something, okay? So an advanced imaging fellow reading a very basic, completely normal transthoracic echo, right? They're probably not gonna learn anything at that point in time versus somebody who's not very competent, okay? Maybe an early stage learner at something new, needs a lot of supervision, and the task is really difficult. So maybe this is your first year fellow reading a very complex adult congenital echo, right? That's gonna be, I can't, I'm way too anxious to understand that versus I'm so bored, I'm gonna fall asleep, okay? So where you really wanna go, where the accelerated learning is right that sweet spot, right? Where it's just hard enough to make me nervous, but it's not so hard that I start to shut down. If you remember maybe one of the first times that you were in the CCU, maybe an attending that was like a little intimidating and they asked you questions and you got a little sweaty. Like I'm a person that sweats when I get nervous. And so I like visibly was getting nervous, but it was good for me because to be honest, I never forgot the answers to those questions because I was just a hint nervous. Now, on a bad day when that attending made me very nervous and there were other like pressing questions, I got to the point where I couldn't learn, right? So think about those moments in your life where you're like, oh man, that teaching point was like imprinted on my mind. And that's because you were really at that learning edge. Finding the learning edge for yourself and more importantly, as an educator for others is really important. And everybody's learning edge is a little bit different. So it takes work as an educator to find that. Okay, but that's the sweet spot and it's where we want to go. Now, I talked a little bit about the science of learning, right? Not just the art, but the science of learning. And there's this entire field that is developed on brain-based learning. These are a couple of my favorite books. And if you are at all interested in being a medical educator or just interested in how your brain works, I would read Make It Stick. One of my all-time favorite books. It's an easy book. It is not it's not like medicine-based, but it's all about how your brain works and how it can work better. I would read Make It Stick. And really, just to kind of hone in on what this is, you know, it's not a fluffy science. It's not a social science. There is evidence here for how our brain works when we are learning. I'm going to show you some pictures to get down to a really basic level in a second. Sure, many of us have seen this fancy picture of how the brain is active, right? And all of the pathways that we have. But what I think is fascinating is this. We've actually shown that where all of these stars are, when we learn something new, something changes in each one of these areas. So this is a basic science. I know many of us in the field tend to think about learning as not a basic science. But it actually is, if you want to get down to the cellular level, the pre and the post synapse, the nucleus, all of the modifiers, it is there. We can do it. I'm not going to talk about that today, but this is a deep science, okay? What I'm going to talk about is really what is learning. Learning is active. So it's an active process that takes ATP, okay? It takes energy for us to learn. It is not just you sitting here and sitting in the room and being passively listening, okay? The active process is you actually doing the things in your brain. When I say, think about a time when you were in the CCU. If you don't just think about a time when you were in the CCU, you're not gonna learn as much. So it is active, okay? This is a process also where you get knowledge that is acquired through experience, through study, or being taught, okay? And it's these three things. It's the acquisition of information, by getting it, processing and storing it, and then transferring it to the deep brain. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here. It was the brain processing, which I think is a really important thing as we think about medical education. How we process information really is the beginning of how information even gets into our brain. There's this picture. So you have on the far left-hand side, incoming information. And that's literally everything. It's not just my slides. So everybody in this room can see my slide, and you can also feel a temperature. you feel comfortable or uncomfortable in your seat. There's a certain level of lighting here. There might be a smell depending on who you're sitting next to. And that counts as all the incoming information, okay? Your memory, your brain takes that in, and much of the sensory memory now will go away. You will forget the majority of the sensory memory, meaning for the large majority of the content that you have been exposed to today, my guess is you don't immediately recall what the lighting in the room was or what the temperature of the room was, unless it's an extreme. Okay, so your brain purposefully gets rid of that because it's too much information and it's hopefully not that relevant. Now, I just called attention to it in this talk, which might trigger your brain in the future. Then you get to information passes into the working memory. And as everybody knows, our working memory is finite. So we don't have tons of space in our working memory. And our goal is to get it from the working memory all the way into the long-term memory. Because in the long-term memory, you can constantly pull it out and use it again, okay? But the trick is you have to get it from the working memory into the long-term memory, okay? And there are tricks as to how you get that. So you can rehearse it or repeat it, okay? And that is much more likely to get it into long-term memory. There are special ways that you can encode that information, meaning linking it with other things that might already be in your long-term memory. And you can retrieve it. So if something goes to your long-term memory and somebody asks you to recall something, then you are much more likely to keep that something in your long-term memory for longer, okay? So when we think about this, we also think about all that incoming information. And this is what gets complicated. So we have both our intrinsic and our extrinsic cognitive load. Many people have already talked probably about your cognitive load, but I want to draw attention to the two different things. So the extraneous cognitive load is all the things that make it hard to concentrate. So it might be that there's noise in the background. You're trying to read something, but you keep hearing, and many of us on virtual calls nowadays, I'm trying to concentrate on that virtual call, but somebody has their microphone that's not muted. And so that distracts me, and that's extraneous information. That increases my cognitive load where I do not want it to be increased, right? I want to simplify everything possible in my extraneous cognitive load because those are really distractions, okay? And I really want to focus on this intrinsic stuff. So the intrinsic stuff is the content. If I was here talking about cardio-obstetrics, the intrinsic thing would be what are the hemodynamic changes during pregnancy? I'd really want you to think about that. I wouldn't want you to remember what I'm wearing, right? So I shouldn't wear something that's really extreme one way or the other because that will distract you and will be extraneous, okay? In terms of your extrinsic cognitive load. Now, putting it in terms of medical education, if I do this, I just decreased your extrinsic cognitive load by making it easier to read that slide, right? You don't have to work as hard. Your brain does not have to work as hard to see that part of the picture now, right? So I just decreased the work of your brain to do the thing. I don't want you to work to read that. I just want you to see it, right? I want you to know it. So that's the difference. When you go to a talk and somebody uses 12-point font and tons of words, the reason it's hard for you to retain all of that is because that's a ton of extrinsic cognitive load. Okay, so you as a speaker, the purpose is to decrease the extrinsic load. Okay, make things simple for your learners so that they don't have to do the work to learn. They can just learn the thing that you want them to learn. All right. All right. So now pop quiz time. You guys didn't know that I was going to do a pop quiz. Right? Okay, true, false, it's all true, false. I'm not A, B, C, D, E. This is just true, false. True, false, we have a specific style of learning, meaning I'm an auditory learner, I'm a kinesthetic learner, I'm a visual learner. Who says true, I have a specific style of learning? Who says true? Who says true? Okay, and who says false? Who says false? Okay, oh, brave false people. Okay, it's false. It's false. So our brain actually learns best when we engage more than one sense at a time. Okay, so true, you might like to learn one of those ways. That might be your preference. I love to listen to podcasts. Great. I actually learn best, I retain the most when I listen and read information about a podcast. Okay, so this is something that's been in, gosh, all of education, far beyond medical education for a very long time. This is very popular. It's like taking a personality test, right? I'm an ENTJ, right? Like, and people will be like, oh, I'm an auditory visual. Like, no, this is actually not true. So every study that has been done to try to prove that audio versus visual versus kinesthetic actually has had negative results. Okay, so tons and tons of people have tried to prove that this could actually happen, and every single study has been shown to not have it. I listed a couple of the studies down at the bottom. What I would say is that everybody has a learner preference, a style preference that I like, but to be honest, we all retain things the best in that long-term memory if we encode them in a couple different ways. So if I see and hear and write it, that's 3 different pathways for me to get to the long-term memory, right? So that encoding is what's most important. And you guys have this really great center. I was doing research for this talk. If you guys don't know the Center for I'm just out of curiosity, do you guys know about the center? And have you ever used it? Just go Google it. This is a really like awesome resources here. And you can get, you know, like 101 of my master's degree just on these web pages. It's really, really, truly terrific. All right, pop question number 2, true, false. Stress is bad for the memory. True, stress is bad for the memory. True, 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 true. Some people. Okay, false, stress is not bad for the memory. Okay, all right. So it depends. And I'm going to tell you the Goldilocks story here. Stress is kind of like Goldilocks, honestly. Stress, if there's too little, this is getting back to the learning edge. If stress is too little or too much, you have to have it just right. Okay, so from the Goldilocks principle and from the accelerated learning on the learning edge, we get to the Yerkes-Dodson law bell curve. And this is a theory that really shows you exactly what that learning edge shows you or thinks. It's that right in that middle, moderate amount of stress. And I can do a whole nother talk on psychological safety, but this is presuming psychological safety. Okay, so moderate level of stress in a safe place, and that is where you are going to learn the most. If you are under aroused or not stressed enough, you're going to be bored. And again, similar to what I showed before, if you're overstressed, you're not going to learn anything because you're going to be too anxious. So it depends. It's like a tricky, not appropriate, true, false question, bad educator. All right, true, false, the learning curve can be modified. True, the learning curve can be modified. True, mostly. False, it cannot. False. Okay, I'm mostly true on this, and you guys are now getting smarter during this lecture. So let's just remind each other of what the learning curve is. This is the learning curve. As you learn something, your ability to recall it immediately after you learned it is high. And after learning, slowly, the more and more time that you have, the less likely you are able to recall it. And so this is the learning curve. Others of us call the second half of the curve the forgetting curve. Okay, how much do I forget? And this has been documented in all sorts of didactic lectures. So how much can you recall from an hour-long didactic lecture the day after versus the week after versus the month after versus the year after? Okay, and Harlan and I were talking about scientific sessions, and I agree that I am not convinced, despite being the vice chair and future chair of scientific sessions, I'm not convinced that sitting in a didactic panel at a scientific session actually increases your long-term retention of something, right? You have to use this. And so one of the ways that we can interrupt our learning curve is with repetition. And I showed that in the very beginning of the processing information. If you rehearse it, meaning if you repeat that information, you're much more likely to be able to move it from the working memory to the long-term memory. So that repetition then increases the amount of information that you can recall over time. So note for those people who are studying for any sort of board or anything like that, repetition is helpful, okay? There's a science to it. All right, let's get to it. This is like a very hot topic, and we kind of got to this from the fellows talk this afternoon, and attention span is decreasing. True. Attention span is decreasing. True. Okay. False? False. Okay, some falsers here. I like the false. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but back in 2015, there was a study that Microsoft did, and they measured goldfish's attention span, which God only knows what they used it just by where their eyes looked as some marker of what their attention was. And they deemed that goldfish looked at things in a span of 9 seconds versus a human who changed their eyes in 8 seconds. And they use that as an indirect marker of attention span. And I would say, I don't really know about that. I'm not convinced that that's truly a measure of a human's attention span. But you know, there's been a lot of attention to this over the past number of years. And so this woman, Gloria Mark, who's a very intelligent woman, wrote this entire book about attention span. And she did a study here that shows a decrease in attention span, again, as measured by your focus on a screen. So how long I focus on a single screen before I look around to something else. And over time, 2004, 150 seconds, all the way to 2023, 45 seconds. And so many people have concluded that attention span is decreasing. I personally don't think that attention span is decreasing. I've looked for studies to actually show the measurement of true human innate attention span. And I would actually say that there are studies that show that you can combat the focus and you can increase your attention span, meaning you can increase the time that you stare at something by doing certain activities, meaning your attention span hasn't actually decreased. It's just that our distractions have increased, right? If you look at all those different distractions and what we think about the extrinsic cognitive load, right? That's all extrinsic cognitive load that's going to distract us. And then you think about this, right? And that my brain is trained on social media where I am taught that I get more information if I constantly scroll up or slide, right? So we are actually being trained to look at different things all of the time. But our attention span innately, I'm not convinced that it is decreasing at all. It's just our behavior. All right. We're going to pause for a second and interrupt our own learning curve. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Think of all the things that I have talked about in the past 10 seconds, in the next 10 seconds, and name one that you think you learned. Maybe it's an adult learning principle. Maybe it's a myth that you learned. Okay, so think about this for a second, and I have a clock here. I'll give you another 5. And I'm going to remind you, right? My job is to interrupt your forgetting curve. Andragogy, right? Art and Science of Adult Learning, built on concepts like self-directedness, immediately applicable, experiential learning, and applied to real life. Learning requires information processing, and most importantly, it is an active process. And science tells us all of these things. We should engage all of our senses, not just one of them. A little stress goes a long way. Forgetting can be interrupted with repetition and rehearsal, and distractions decrease our attention span. All right. What I just did there, sneaky way, what I asked you to do, say, come up with one thing that you remember, and I gave you time. That's called retrieval. Okay. Retrieval is one of those principles that allows you to retain it longer into the long-term memory. If you do that with your learners, rather than giving them a multiple choice question, they should be able to retrieve some information from their brain or from the content that you just talked about before you give it to them. They're much more likely to remember it in the long term if you force them to do that. All right. So trick, I haven't talked about any of this, right? We haven't talked about the future of medical education, and you guys did not come to an entire talk to learn about the main 101 of adult learning. So I promise I'm going to get there. And we're going to use these 3 pictures as we talk about the future of medical education. All right. First one on the far left-hand side, we'll get to in a second, but first I want you to think about how do we and where do we learn right now? How and where do we learn? Virtual versus in-person? Synchronous versus asynchronous? Formal versus informal, meaning this is a formal setting. We have grand rounds. You guys all showed up on time at the same time on the same day. That's a formal thing. Informal would be, I just ran into you in the hallway after reading Echo and I said, oh, hey, by the way, I saw this really interesting tumor. And then you taught me some content about some, cardiac tumor, right? That would be informal. Neither of us planned to have that conversation. That's informal learning. Intentional versus unexpected, similar, but not exactly the same. Natural versus artificial, which we'll get to with AI. Live versus recorded, alone versus a group. All these things are binary, right? And we got really good at thinking in binary ways in the pandemic. We're still coming out of that. I think many of us as program directors are still feeling the effects of pandemic. Medical education will never be the same, thankfully. Medical education will never be the same. We've got some work to do to get the future, but I am pretty convinced that the future is not binary, okay? I am completely convinced that the future is blended, that it is this beautiful mix of a lot of different things: virtual, synchronous, asynchronous, live, in person, formal, informal, all of the things. It's going to be this beautiful mix, just like what's happening with these kids at the table, right? So it's a mix of a lot of learning going on. They are learning together as a pair. They're writing, but they also have a computer in front of them. They've got a supervisor maybe doing dishes in the background who might be doing some formal teaching and coming over and say, I'm going to direct your teaching right now. There's a lot going on in a picture like this. They might be arguing. Maybe there's part of the debate in their learning. I think many of us learn when we watch debates in medical education. I am completely convinced that education in the future will be much more fluid than we have thought about it over the past couple decades, but certainly much more fluid than we thought about it in the past 2 years. All right. And this really gets us to how we will learn, where and how we will learn. I think a lot of times it's going to be like this, right? In groups. My hope is that we get back to a lot of in-person group learning. But I'd like to expand that concept of learning to communities, right? So learning in a community allows you the space and the structure to learn different things and align around a shared goal. For many of us who lead any sort of division area, the shared goal is to take care of patients better, right? I mean, that's like the entire purpose of medical education in general is for us to care for patients better. It's all the science. We're all doing this so that we can better humanity. And notice that all of these communities are really across a lot of boundaries. And what I'm going to do right now is share my communities. And I'm going to task you with thinking about your community. So I work at this place. Okay, it's a massive, massive, huge institution. And these are some of the things within UPMC that I consider my communities. My Heart Vascular Institute, which is our service line. Pitt Medicine, which entails our undergraduate medical education and some of our residents outside of cardiology. Then I have MedEd. This is the Institute of Clinical Research and Education. That's where I got my master's degree. That's another learning community that might not be in those other areas. I'm lucky to have had a lot of community that I found in the American College of Cardiology. That's a picture of a bunch of program directors. We had a program director symposium. I love program directors. They are like-minded and they have a lot of same experiences. And so this has been my community. I reach out to my PDs for help at any time. I also have a community of reproductive and cardio-obstetrics, reproductive health and cardio-obstetrics. That's a new member section. I learn a lot with the group in that member section. And obviously I learn a lot at scientific session and all of the faculty that are presenting at those meetings. I consider them my community. I learn with them. I learn with people who listen to podcasts. I talk to the fellows who all listen to Cardio Nerds at this point. We learn together. Just because you don't listen together doesn't mean that you can't share the information. So if you listen to the same podcast as somebody, they are in your learning community. I am also lucky because I come from a family of cardiologists. So when I go home for the holidays, both my father and my brother are cardiologists. I learn at home. So I'm constantly sharing cases with them and teaching things with each other. My learning community, markedly different. I always learn with my patients. This is one of my patients who asked specifically for us to take his picture and to use it publicly. So this is Father Joe, and he loves to be in all of my talks. So I will use him as much as possible because he teaches me a lot of things. And then, you know, one of the last things is that I learn with you. Today, I learned a ton from everybody that I met with, and I am forever grateful for those conversations, even if they were just 5 minutes. I consider you part of my learning community now. And I am glad that it is big, right? Every single community that we have and that we invest in makes our learning a little bit better. And so I think the future will be fruitful and dreamy if we continue to connect and grow our communities, to be thoughtful about those communities. This is one of your communities. I mean, don't look at me because I'm not staying here for more than another, day, but you guys learn with each other on a regular basis. When you come and choose to come in person or online to grand rounds, you get to learn with each other. And as much as the program directors have been talking about, there's a lot of benefit beyond the content of my slides that you get from learning together in the same room, in the same group. I would highly encourage you, please lean into your learning communities. Think about what they are and be active in them, because I think you will get much more from them that way. All right, the second picture, this was the middle one. Data. What tools do we use to learn and to educate, right? That's a somewhat generic. I'm sure Rohan and Harlan are gonna judge me for my data, quote unquote, picture, but I know there's a lot of data out there, and I think we think about big data in healthcare, and I wanna challenge us to think about big data in medical education. When you have all of these levels, med student, residents, and beyond to fellowship, we actually collect a fair amount of data, okay? So we have grades, we have physical diagnosis, we have clerkships, we have OSCEs. Grades are questionable because most places are going away with grades nowadays. That's why there's a big question mark there. And most people go to pass fail now. Similar to STEPS, we no longer get stores, we just get pass fail. But even then, we still have a bunch of other data. 360 evaluations, we have the data that we get from the clinical competency committee. Then we do an in-training exam. Fellows took the in-training exam. I know that, and maybe it doesn't sit well with you. We'll talk about that in a second. And then even for continuous medical education, once you're done with all the training, you still have all the recertification and annual learning, right? So there's actually a fair amount of data in medical education. I'm going to dive deep into the in-training exam. I think it's a really nice example. This is old, so 8 or 9 years ago. So this is not my current fellows because I don't want to show them. But this is, my guess is you guys probably don't see this. As a program director, this is what we get. When we get our in-training exam scores back, you get a span of how your team did, how your fellows did. So I get this information. I have one person who did really poorly, right? And then some people that did better, right? And then where my mean and my minimum max mean are, okay? So helpful, I can see more helpful. So then you get this picture. So there's a lot of information. You have on the far left-hand column, all of the subject areas. And then you have my fellows in that first column compared to all first-year fellows across the nation. My second years compared to all second years across the nation, third years and so forth, right? This is my information. It's a lot of information, but really when you dig in, you can actually see what are my strengths? My first-year fellows did better than other first-year fellows in those areas. And then somehow I managed to make my third-year fellows less intelligent because they do poorly than on their in-training. I don't know, does that happen to you, Ed? Yeah, they get worse at taking exams. And so then they do worse than the third-year fellows across. But for me, this is really helpful as a program director. I can identify where we are really strong and what changes I need to make in the curriculum, and where we are really weak and what changes we need to make in the curriculum, right? And then every single fellow gets their individual data, and that can be for your precision studying. But as a program director, this is really helpful. Now, I'm going to pause for just a second and talk about testing, because I think there's a lot of feelings about testing, right? Feelings in medical school, the anxiety that comes with testing and scores and pass fail and all those things. And I just want to think two types of tests. One, this, which you guys are all familiar with, this bubble studies and multiple choice question. And this, right? Vision test, eye test, it's a test. It's a test. And if we started to think about testing in medicine more like this, to identify our gaps so that we can know where we need support, I think it would do us well. Testing doesn't have to be punitive, okay? It can actually, the entire purpose of it is to find our gaps. So if you are taking the in-training exam, that score goes nowhere, right? I tell my fellows all the time, use it so that you know what your weakness is. Use it so that you know what your strength is. Use it so that when you have an hour to study, you spend it on something that you know you are weak in rather than something that you are really strong, right? Good testing is hard to do well. I'm just comment on testing in general. It is not all bad. It is not black and white, unlike these pictures, okay? And I think it does serve a purpose, but we have not used testing in a good way over historically in medicine and beyond. All right, back on the data. Program directors also got a bunch of information. This is the dreaded ACGME survey. You guys take it, all the faculty members and all of the fellows take the ACGME survey, residents take it too. You take it once a year and we get judged on all these things, right? So this is like the bane of most program directors' existence, because if you get dinged on this, then you have a lot of explaining to do. It's more paperwork. And most program directors, provided you don't get in trouble by your chiefs or your GME, actually think that the data is really helpful, right? Most of the time. It is not completely, but most of the time this is very, very helpful. And then there's another thing, clear focus. Does anybody know what the clear focus is? Clinical learning environment review. This happens maybe like once every 10 years, where there's a big group from ACGME that comes in and they observe in all of these areas and they collect data on this. And, you know, I think all of these areas of data actually really, really helpful. And it's gotten to the point where people think that this amount of data, it's actually really helpful to guide the future of education. And I personally think that this is exactly where we need to go. Evidence-based education, not medicine. Evidence-based education is really where we should go. There is a way to do this. It is not easy, but it takes some dedication and use of the data that we are now collecting. I'm going to push you a little bit further though on this data and talk about a concept that maybe we can start to think about. What if we used determinants of learning, determinants of education, okay? Not social determinants of health, but determinants of education. Where'd you grow up? What type of schooling did you go to? I gave you my entire educational history, right? One would think that that educational history is markedly different than somebody who didn't go to those types of schools or have those types of experiences. And then on top of that, you think about financial and social, other types of activities, what the context of that learning was. You put it into a fancy machine, okay, jumble it all up to optimize learning. And this is really where we're going to get to learning analytics. This is a big, huge thing. Probably the best learning analytics in medical education right now is out of NYU. They use some really interesting informatics in learning. And I think this is probably what's going to change our minds, so that if we collect all of that information on you as a learner, I can predict where you're going to have a harder time versus an easier time. And then I can do precision education. Set up precision medicine, precision education based on these analytics, okay? Now, this might sound familiar, and this is something that is starting to hit the press in med ed, okay? In the scholarly world of medical education, people are starting to say, let's use it in clinical competency committees. How can I take the analytics and the data there and make it better? And it's a hop, skip, and a jump away from artificial intelligence, right? We're using all of the words that are the same, right? Artificial intelligence in medical education. Well, then now all of a sudden I just got scary, right? Because now we're going to talk about ChatGPT, because artificial intelligence, most people automatically think of ChatGPT these days, and how we use this in medical education and medicine in general, but also in medical education. I would tell you that honestly, having ChatGPT do a test, whether it's the USMLE test or any sort of board or ACC SAP or anything like that, honestly, that's not education. That's not using ChatGPT. That's just testing ChatGPT to take a test. That's not using ChatGPT for education. We'll get there. Many people, and I think those who are in charge of journals, think about ChatGPT. I don't know, Rohan, do you guys have rules about ChatGPT use? Do you make people just declare it, or do you say no, not at all? Declare it, right? So ChatGPT, if you're going to use ChatGPT in any way as your author, you now have to declare it. But when this first came out just a year and a half ago, people were really upset about this. What do you mean ChatGPT can't be an author? How do we have to make rules, right? What are the policies around this? Should they be completely excluded? Can they be partially included? How much do we have to share? And this has been a burden for every single editor at a medical journal. And I think it's going to continue to evolve. Honestly, I don't think that we truly know the answer. What I'm going to just put up is some opportunities. So generative AI or ChatGPT, opportunities and medical education, not medicine, but in medical education. You actually could use ChatGPT and say, take this page, copy paste, and summarize it for me. I'm having a hard time understanding this, summarize it for me. And it can spit out some summaries, right? You can personalize your learning with the top 10 areas of cardiology that are most important to learn in prevention, right? And that can help you direct some of your learning. There are places, Khan Academy now has an AI, a chat GPT-ish personal tutor that you can use in Khan Academy. There's simulation of clinical scenarios. So I can say, write a case about a pregnant person who has a mechanical valve, write a case for me. You can use that then to come up with multiple choice questions, right? So if you're a person who is writing an exam, maybe for a medical school, and you want to, get an easy draft, you might want to say, let me get these first 10 questions and then I'll look at them, right? It's scalable for much. It's not super expensive. I think that the fellows taught me that the premium chat GPT right now is $20 a month. Not all that expensive. And it's accessible. So it's in multiple languages and it's available 24/7. So I don't have to wait for somebody who's awake and available from 9 to 10 a.m. Right? Now, before you get too excited, there are a fair amount of limitations. I am not here to tell you that chat GPT is the end all be all of medical education, nor am I clear as to what exactly it will be in the future. Just be careful. If you are going to use generative AI, the quality and the accuracy of the information is still at question. There's a limited understanding of context depending on what generative AI you are using and what model it is being trained on. There's lack of human interaction, which for those of us who care deeply about communication, okay, and human interaction, you cannot do that on ChatGPT. There are ethical concerns, privacy, data security, bias, authorship, right? We're tackling some of these slowly but surely, but certainly lots of Pandora's boxes here. There's lack of hands-on practice. I can't imagine that somebody would be willing to have a cath by somebody who learned how to do cath by ChatGPT. So in a field that is procedural based, this is not going to be where we go. Limited emotional support. And, there's an entire concern with generations, and honestly, multiple generations now, of over-reliance on technology. So this is what I will say about generative AI and ChatGPT. The jury is out. We have a ton of learning to do. Data can help us, okay? It's not the only thing, it is a tool. Data is a tool for us to get there. It can be the foundation of evidence-based education, okay? But generative AI and technology really it's not the final solution to everything. All right, last picture. And I think I'm doing okay on time. We'll end in 2 minutes. Last picture is this picture, just a simple picture of the brain. And I really want to get us to thinking about thinking or learning about learning. And this is really metacognition, okay? The concept of metacognition has been around for a very, very long time, and applying it to medical education is vital. If I have my choice, I will stand up on a stage before a scientific session and say, before we talk about any cardiology, I want you to think about how your brain works. Honestly, don't spend time going to a conference or studying for boards or anything unless you do a little bit of work on how your brain works. Those of you who have learned about learning, which is all of you in this audience and online, are better students and teachers, and we know this. And these are all the things that you have already learned. We did this. This is another sneaky way for me to repeat things for you, okay? You are seeing some of my slides again. My hope is that the repetition gets it into your long-term brain a little bit better. But all of these things, this learning about learning how your brain works, what context it works better, what context it works worse when there are lots of distractions, your brain is not going to be as functional as you want it to be. So my plea to you is to commit to lifelong learning. This is an active process. It takes your conscious commitment, okay? Whether you are a learner or an educator, all of us are both at some point in time. And your commitment to this specifically, not the field of cardiology, but the field of medical education, will be better if you commit to it deeply. So these are my final takeaways, okay? Future of medical education is best if it's built on andragogical or adult learning principles. The concepts of learning science are essential for both you as a learner and you as an educator. It includes metacognition, okay? Think about thinking, learn about learning. And last but not least, the learning communities, which I am lucky to be on with you, learning data and that metacognition will bring forward a dreamy, fingers crossed, future. I have 2 asks of you. I do not do my job if I do not change the world a little bit. So I have 2 pieces of homework and they're relatively easy, okay? One choice, one is an employ one of the practices that we talked about today in the adult learning principles to rounds, okay? Sometime in the next week or 2. And then this one's easier on the right-hand side. Just reflect on your way home tonight, maybe when you're laying in bed, maybe when you're brushing your teeth. Reflect on your learning communities and think about at least one way that you can expand your learning community. I guarantee you will be better for it in the long run. With that, I will say thank you and take any questions.
Katie, thank you. What a privilege to have you here, and what an inspirational talk for all of us. And we really all enjoyed meeting with you today. One comment as you challenged our faculty to take one thing away, and I know that Rohan's on service next week. That doesn't mean you can use stress in your learners.
Just a little bit. Just a little.
I have a question about fact-based learning versus teaching this difficult concept of judgment, right? Can you apply the same tools that you've used about this seem to be focused on fact-based medical learning to the ideas of imparting judgment and humanism?
Absolutely. By judgment, do you mean like medical decision-making? And by fact, do you mean like rote memorization or recall of facts? Okay, yes. Thinking about the learning edge, right? My goal with all of my learners, I actually don't really want them to recall facts. I actually encourage them to look facts up. If they need to look up a fact, that's fine. My goal as an educator is to get them to figure out where they have a hard time applying that fact. So I give them permission, use your phone. That's fine. You can use your phone, look up the answer to something, and then we're going to talk about that piece of information that you use and how we're going to apply it directly to said patient. So I think you actually can, but it's harder, depending on which level of learner. Some of your medical students actually need to learn the facts, right? So adults, we all have a different amount of framework. And so even cardiology fellows, when you come into cardiology fellowship, you're still building your framework. You don't know how a standard echo is done, what the protocol of a standard echo, you're learning those things, right? But to be honest, I don't need you to memorize the standard echo protocol at some point. I need you to know, what do I get out of this picture, this parasternal long? What's the point of the parasternal long, right? And so pushing them not to just memorize what this is and what the structures are that they see, but why they have this there. Why do we take a picture of this aortic valve in 5 different views, right? Like, so those are the things to me that I think is important. That's harder to do as an educator. You really have to think about, honestly, the lazy way is to recall facts. And foundational learning, fine, but I give permission to most of my fellows and residents to look up a fact and then force them to apply it in some way. Hopefully that answers the question.
I'll ask a question, then bring it over to Jim. So phenomenal talk. Thank you for
you.
being with us.
Thank
and I'm
you.
so happy you enjoyed your time. So I'm gonna first comment. I think the hardest echo to read is the normal echo.
Yeah, true.
Okay.
True. Said
so I
by,
had
like,
to send it out
yeah,
there
most
into the world.
senior.
Could you tell us how you help your fellows learn to listen to patients, listen to each other,
Yeah.
and learn from each other? And then
Yeah, our fellows, so we do a couple different things. In the beginning of the year in July, the first week of July, I sit down and I actually give a very similar learning science talk. And we have an entire 2-day course built around communication in the patient care setting, which really is structured in a way of communication, how to have structured conversations about things that are hard in cardiology, but more than half of that is about learning, about listening to what the patients say, and not just their words that they use, but the context of everything. So the emotional context and setting of that. Sometimes patients will ask questions. So we actually do it in a pretty structured way. And then we have continuous interactive noon conferences throughout the year that are about communication in general. So that's how we do it. It's pretty intense. Yeah, I think on a whole nother topic, I think communication is probably the hardest part of being a physician and a provider in any way. And I also think it is the most important skill as a leader. Communication, if you can crack that nut, that is by far the most that you can do. And honestly, as an educator, if you can figure out how to communicate as an educator and use words and examples and pictures and tell stories that communicates principles, and fingers crossed, I hope I did a little bit of that tonight, but the goal of communication is really for somebody to understand what it is that you're thinking. I think that is across everything that we do. So yeah, I could read books about communication. I can come back and talk about that, but yes, important.
Thank you for a really great talk.
Yeah.
I am curious about this concept of personalized learning. And once you identify personalized learning objectives from the perspective of a program director, and you have 24 fellows, for example, how do you apply that information and enhance their learning?
So good. You will have, as a program director, you will have all of your fellows who have a personalized study and learning plan. And then you also have a curriculum that is for all of your program, right? Some of those things will overlap, not all of those things will overlap. And so in my fellowship, when we give the in-training exam scores back, I give them homework. I'm obviously a big fan of homework. It's not like I taught elementary school, but I believe that homework is good for us to hold us all accountable. I make all of them look at it, and then I have them email me back with two things. One is, what is your strength and weakness? So show me that you actually looked at the data and did your homework of figuring out where you were. And then the second thing, really important, is what's your study plan for those weaknesses? Identify specifically what resource you're going to use, what time you're going to do, what activity you're going to do, to tell me how you're going to account for and improve upon that weakness. That's the personalized, individualized learning plan. And then I think about the rest of it, that big kind of picture with all of those. That's when I think about my curriculum. What are my didactics going to be? So your guys' Wednesday conference, I need to plan and make sure if I have a program weakness in adult congenital, I need to make sure that there's actually more than what we had last year in those Wednesdays, right? So that's the difference of group versus individual. And how data, most importantly, how data plays into that. Yeah.
Is this on? Oh, thank you for that phenomenal talk. It was very engaging. I really enjoyed it. And, I wanted to ask you sort of your thoughts. This is kind of like a pedagogical nerd or a question, but, I've noticed in discussions about undergraduate medical education in particular, debates about, what are the most effective pedagogical approaches. And, there are some people sort of in the camp, the sort of, I'll call it the categorical camp of, these modern, more active learning methods are always more effective. So TBL, PBL, that's always better. And then there's sort of the contextual camp, which is that some material actually is more amenable to being taught via more traditional lecture, albeit a lecture that's done well, minimizing extrinsic distractors, interactive, much like you gave a lecture today. And sort of what are your thoughts? Like, do you fall into one of those camps, and kind of why?
I've thought about this before, and my answer is that it's blended. I don't think, and truly similar to my answer to the binary that we've had. I actually personally don't think that it's an either or, especially for medical students. They have to do some of the independent framework on their own. Some lectures are okay. Now, are some lectures better than others? Certainly, right? Are some speakers better than others? Sure. If we're going to do lectures, then we should train those educators to be really good lecturers and employ some of the principles that I hope I employed and really showed you best model practices today. Okay. So if you have lecturers who can do that, then yes, put them in front of medical students. And yes, medical students should be reading books. I'm not saying throw out all of the books. Okay. You should read, but there are ways to learn from reading, which is not just passively reading 10 pages at once. And I tell my fellows this: if you're going to study for boards and you read a chapter and something, at the end of that chapter, close the book, take a blank piece of paper out and write down everything that you can remember. Okay, so there are ways that we can learn, but we're just not teaching the medical students that. And then I do think that interactive learning really enhances those things so that you build a community and you also figure out where your gaps are, right? Because you're not going to figure out where your gaps are in a didactic lecture like this, right? For the most part. Maybe if you did some of your own like deep thinking while I was talking, good for you. And you figured out a gap, right? Or I did a true false and you got it wrong. You figured out your gap, right? But not everybody is going to do that on their own. So I personally think it's blended for that purpose. And it's not an either or, it's that we should be doing both.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Sitting there thinking, okay,
stuff set.
what's learning for? So are we going to learn
Yeah.
to apply some knowledge?
Yeah. Yep.
Or are we learn to
Yeah.
create knowledge? And especially if you are in a major academic center, are these going to be different or
Yep.
the same skills?
Yes. They are on a continuum. I'm going to get back to this. Where is it? Here we go. Because I have this in parentheses. So learning is for usable knowledge, right? Usable, whether it's to create something new or to use that information in a different way, whether it's for a patient or to create science, but it's usable in whatever way. So learning is the process of attaining usable knowledge. So if I can never use the knowledge that I got, then that's useful, like not very useful, right?
But if you learn in echo and your goal is to create knowledge in echo, it's very important to learn the physics of it.
True.
If you're going to read echoes every day and make sure you don't miss normals, probably don't need that much physics. So it depends on what the goal is.
Interesting. I would argue that the physics is foundational to the application and to the identification of things like artifact and shadows and whatnot. And so do you need to recall the details of that physics? No. Do you need the context and the framework of that physics at some point to actually be able to daily apply that and figure out maybe this was done wrong or inappropriately? So you are correct. The exact details always, but we need all of that to create a context or a structure, scaffolding per se, for us. Now, the rest of those physics details, you are right. I took echo boards and my brain has certainly forgotten many of those. I tested, I passed, I learned it at one point, and now it is no longer in my long-term brain memory. I don't know that it's I'm not convinced. Don't judge me, but I'm not sure that all of that information is retrievable. Some of it is, right? Some of that information is, but not all of it. And so to your point, it does very much so. And this is why it's really important for adults to learn something that is real life applicable, right? Because if you're not going to use it in your day-to-day long-term life, you're actually not going to retain it for a long term. So those of us who read a little bit more echo and think about, maybe research in echo are going to use that. Those of us that are reading only and not doing the research, those physics principles are maybe a little less important. So good point.
Rachel, last question.
Maybe this is too big of a question
Yeah.
for the last question, but your very first slide, you
Yeah.
showed some positive stuff on one side.
Oh,
learners
dreamy and
being
doomed. Yeah.
passionate, learners being entitled.
Yeah.
And do you think those positives and negatives, are those just in the eyes of the beholder?
Yeah.
And how do we move the negatives to the positives?
Yeah.
I guess, do you think learners are entitled or passionate? And
Well, some people do.
how do-
So
how do you-
I tended to make this slide. If you are a person that thinks the first adjective that comes to mind about learners is entitled, then most likely the future of medical education is doomed, right? If I think that all students are entitled, medical students now, the future's doomed. What's the point, right? Whereas if I tend to think that learners are passionate, right? And they want to learn about all of the social determinants of health and all of the other things, but not how S1 and S2 works. I'm glad that they're passionate, right? I don't think that but I think that that's dreamy, right? Like I think I can work with that passion. That's really fine. And likewise for any of these scores and grades, for those of us that take data into account, scores and grades, I do think that's helpful, but there's a lot of people in UME right now across the country who think that scores and grades are completely biased and should be outlawed. There's a whole, and that movement is here. That's how we got to where pass fail everything pass fail step 1, pass fail step 2, pass fail grades, like everything is pass fail. That's where they think that scores and grades are useless. I personally think that I honestly have thought all of these things at some point or another, depending on the context, depending on my mood, and that sort of thing. So yes, it's a little bit personal, and I would challenge you, like, where do you sit on this? You know, because I think where you sit on that answer, which adjectives you use, will help you determine how you become an educator, what you do as an educator and as a learner. Honestly, I'm very hopeful that we can be all of these things, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. Yeah. Are we done? Are we done? Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I'll look at. I saw you sent me an email, so I'll look at it. Yeah.
Don't
Great.
like no rush
Yeah. Thank you.
whatsoever.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming and spending time. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Good.
that was just to let me get that.
Oh,
I don't
good.
Forget.
Good.
Like, don't feel obligated to
Okay.
ever look at it.
No. Stop.
But anyway, I
It was
just.
blessed. Thanks for
Thank
driving
you.
around your fancy car and buying me awesome coffee, and we will stay in touch.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll see you at
Bye.
dinner,
Thank
so-
you. Okay, good.
So.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I'll see you. Are you coming to dinner? No. Oh, okay. I can't remember who's coming.
I don't know.
I
what
think
the
there's
list
a
is.
list. Yeah.